The application sat on the glass desk for exactly 4 seconds before Victoria Reynolds stopped breathing. She had read hundreds of these that quarter. HR sent her the janitorial hires now only because she'd insisted on it, a strange executive habit nobody questioned anymore. The woman who built a $12 billion aerospace company but still wanted to see who mopped its floors. Most names meant nothing. This one did. She read it again, certain her eyes were doing what tired eyes do at the end of a 14-hour day, inventing familiar shapes out of strangers' names. But it stayed the same the second time, and the third. Mason Carter. Her pen, mid-signature on the folder beneath it, stopped moving. Across the small interview room, the man himself sat with his hands folded in his lap, a resume in a plain blue folder, a canvas jacket with a frayed cuff, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to expect much from rooms like this one. He didn't fidget, he didn't perform. He answered the recruiter's questions in short, complete sentences, and when asked why he wanted the janitorial position at Reynolds Aerodyne, he said only that the hours worked around his daughter's school schedule, and that he was good at fixing things quietly. Victoria set the pen down. "Mason Carter," she said, and her voice betrayed her, thin in a way it never was in board meetings. He looked up. For half a second something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe dread. Before he folded it back into stillness the way she imagined he'd folded away 100 other things. "Yes, ma'am." The folder in her hands trembled, just slightly, and she set it down too fast, and it slid off the edge of the desk and hit the floor loud enough that the recruiter jumped. Victoria did not move to pick it up. She was looking at the man across from her the way you look at a ghost you owe money to find out how a janitor's application ended up freezing one of the most powerful women in American industry, and what she chose to do next, stay until the very end. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the $12 billion valuation, not the glass tower with her name etched into the lobby floor, not even the company itself in any form that resembled what it would become. 3 years earlier, Victoria Reynolds was 31 years old, and 6 weeks from losing everything. Her startup, back then just called Reynolds Propulsion, had 1 working prototype, 4 remaining employees, and a defense contract that would collapse the moment its engineers discovered, as they eventually would, that the core engine design had a catastrophic thermal flaw nobody on her small, exhausted team could solve. She had already signed the lease renewal she couldn't afford. She had already told her father, who'd mortgaged his house to seed her first round, that everything was on track. It was not on track. Reynolds Propulsion was 6 weeks from a contract cancellation that would have ended the company, buried her credibility in the industry, and put her father's house on the market. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for 3 years, was that an anonymous submission arrived in her company's technical review inbox that spring. A complete engine redesign, correcting the thermal flaw with an elegance her own engineers couldn't replicate, attached to no name, no invoice, no request for royalties or credit. Just the math, clean and total, solving in 11 pages what her team had failed to solve in 11 months. Her lead engineer at the time assumed it came from a consulting firm they'd once floated a partnership with. Nobody asked further. The deadline was too close, the fix too good, and Victoria signed off on implementing it without ever learning whose mind it had come from. The contract was saved. The company survived. Eventually it became what it was now. Towers, thousands of employees, government contracts spanning 3 continents, built unknowingly on the back of a man she'd never met. That man was Mason Carter, and at the time he submitted those 11 pages, he was one of the most respected propulsion engineers at Halbrook Dynamics, a firm twice Reynolds' size, where he'd spent 9 years building a reputation for exactly the kind of quiet, exacting brilliance that made junior engineers nervous to disagree with him in meetings. He had a wife, Elena, a high school chemistry teacher with a laugh people described as the best thing about the building. He had a 2-year-old daughter, Lily, whose photograph sat on his desk in a frame he'd built himself out of aircraft-grade aluminum scrap, a joke between him and Elena that their daughter deserved engineering-grade love. He sent Victoria's team that redesigned not for money and not for credit, but because a former colleague at Reynolds, someone he'd mentored years earlier, had called him in a panic, and he could not stand the thought of good engineers going under for a solvable problem. It took him 4 nights. He asked for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement, because at Halbrook, moonlighting for a competitor, however unpaid, however anonymous, was a fireable offense, and Mason had a mortgage and a daughter, and no interest in risking either over something he considered simple decency. 6 months later, Elena was killed in a highway collision on her drive home from a parent-teacher conference. A drunk driver crossing the median at 71 miles an hour. Mason was left, at 34, with a 3-year-old daughter, a house that suddenly felt enormous, and a mind that could no longer hold engineering problems the way it once had, because it was too busy holding grief. He did not tell his employer why his output slowed. He did not tell them about the nights he sat on Lily's bedroom floor at 3 a.m., because it was the only place in the house that didn't feel like Elena's absence. Halbrook Dynamics did not ask kindly. Within a year, quietly, without any public announcement, Mason Carter was managed out. His projects reassigned, his name removed from patents he'd co-invented, his reputation allowed to erode under the story, spread by a rising colleague named Derek Holt, that Mason had lost his edge after his wife's death and simply couldn't be trusted with critical systems anymore. At the time, Victoria Reynolds knew none of this. She was 3 states away, building the company his silent gift had saved, never once learning the engineer's name. If you've ever watched someone build a life on a kindness they never knew they'd received, you understand exactly the moment waiting at the end of this story. And if these overlooked hero stories mean something to you, the way they seem to mean something to so many of you watching, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. Now, 3 years later, in a glass interview room on the 41st floor of the company Mason's quiet genius had saved, Victoria Reynolds stared at his resume and did not yet understand any of it. She only knew the name. She only knew, somewhere underneath the shock, that a debt she hadn't known she owed had just walked into her building wearing a canvas jacket, asking to be considered for the night janitorial shift. She looked back down at the resume. Under most recent position, it read only, building maintenance, part-time, self-employed, 2 years. Under reason for gap in aerospace employment, Mason had written a single line, family obligations following the passing of my wife. Nothing more. No mention of Halbrook. No mention of the patents with his name scraped off them. No mention of the 11 anonymous pages that had once saved a company he'd never set foot in until today. You worked in aerospace, Victoria said carefully, watching him for a reaction she couldn't name yet. A long time ago, Mason said. I do maintenance work now. I'm good with my hands, and I don't mind night shifts. My daughter's in 3rd grade. I need to be there for the school bus at 7:40 and home by dinner most nights. This role fit the hours. He said it plainly, without apology, without the faint plea for sympathy some interviewees reached for. He simply stated a fact of his life the way he might state a measurement. Victoria found, absurdly, that she believed every word of it and understood almost none of what it was hiding. The recruiter, sensing something unspoken in the room but unable to name it, cleared her throat and asked if there were any final questions. Victoria said there weren't. She told Mason the position was his, effective the following Monday night shift, Building C, and thanked him for his time in a voice that came out steadier than she felt. After he left, she sat alone in the glass room for 11 minutes, the resume still in her hands, and did something she almost never did during business hours. She opened the company's oldest archived files, the ones from the 6-week crisis that had nearly ended everything, and searched for the original anonymous submission. It was still there, exactly as it had arrived. 11 pages, no name, a file simply labeled thermal.fictional. She had never once, in 3 years, wondered who had written it. She had been too busy surviving to wonder. Now she wondered. And some quiet, disciplined part of her, the part that had built an empire out of not looking away from uncomfortable questions, decided she was going to find out exactly who Mason Carter really was, and why a man who had once, anonymously, saved her entire company was now mopping its floors at night to make rent. 8 months would pass before she understood the full shape of what she owed him. But it started that Monday, in Building C at 11 p.m., with a mop bucket and a man nobody in the building recognized as the reason any of them had jobs at all. Halbrook Dynamics had not been cruel in any way that would show up in an exit interview. That was, Mason had come to understand, precisely how modern institutions managed to be cruel without ever technically doing anything wrong. For the first 4 months after Elena's death, they had been, on paper, accommodating. Bereavement leave, then a phased return, then a series of smaller and smaller assignments that his supervisor, a soft-spoken VP named Carol Fenn, described as easing him back in. What actually happened was that Derek Holt, the colleague who had once called Mason his mentor at every company dinner, quietly absorbed the 2 flagship projects Mason had spent years developing, a next-generation combustion chamber and a lightweight alloy housing that Mason had personally solved 18 months of R&D on, and began presenting incremental versions of Mason's own work in meetings Mason wasn't invited to anymore. It came to a head on a Tuesday in March, in a conference room with 11 people in it, when Derek stood at the front of the room and walked the executive team through his redesign of the combustion chamber cooling system, the exact geometry, down to the millimeter, that Mason had sketched on a legal pad 8 months earlier and handed to Derek to sanity check. Because that was the kind of trust Mason still extended to people, even distracted as he was, even grieving as he was. Mason sat in the back of that room. He said nothing. He watched Derek take credit for the work of his hands in front of the people who would decide, 3 weeks later, whether Mason Carter still had a place at the company. And some small, exhausted part of him understood in that exact moment that this was the beginning of the end, and that no one in the room was going to notice, because they had all already decided, quietly and collectively, that the widower with the far-off eyes had lost whatever made him valuable. The dismissal, when it came, was almost gentle. Carol Fenn called him into her office on a Friday afternoon and told him, with what she clearly believed was compassion, that Halbrook needed to restructure around current project needs, that his severance would be generous, that everyone understood how hard the last year had been for him, and that she hoped he'd take the time to focus on himself and his daughter. She used the word understand 4 times in 11 minutes. She never once asked him what had actually happened to his output, whether he was struggling, whether there was anything the company could have done differently. She had already decided the story. Brilliant engineer, tragic loss, understandable decline. It was a kind story. It let everyone feel sympathetic while removing him entirely. Mason did not correct her. He did not mention the combustion chamber, or the 18 months of work, or Derek Holt's presentation to the executive team 3 weeks earlier. He had already run the calculation in his head, the way he ran every calculation, cleanly, without sentiment, and the calculation was simple. Fighting the narrative would take months he didn't have, legal fees he couldn't afford, and a public battle that would put Lily, 6 years old and already grieving her mother, in the center of a story about her father's unraveling. He had exactly one asset he couldn't risk losing, and it wasn't his reputation. It was the ability to pick her up from school every day at 3:15 without a company or a lawsuit demanding his time instead. He shook Carol Fenn's hand, signed the severance agreement, and walked out of Halbrook Dynamics for the last time on a gray Friday in April, carrying a cardboard box that contained, among other things, the aluminum picture frame he'd built for Lily's photo, and nothing else that mattered. If you've ever been the person who understood exactly what was happening to you and chose, for reasons only you could weigh, to stay quiet rather than fight, you already know there's no single right answer to that choice, and it's one so many of you watching have faced in your own way. We'd love to hear in the comments about a time you felt unseen or underestimated the way Mason was in that room, and how you found your way through it. The 2 years that followed were not tragic in any dramatic sense. They were simply small. Mason took what work he could find that let him control his hours. Handyman jobs at first, then steady maintenance contracts with 2 apartment buildings near their house. The kind of work where nobody asked about his degree from Caltech or his 11 patents, 7 of which no longer even carried his name, after Halbrook's legal team quietly amended the filings following his departure, citing administrative correction. He never contested it. He told himself, some nights, that patents were just paper, that what mattered was that Lily had oatmeal in the morning and someone who read to her at night, and mostly he believed it. He kept the anonymous submission he'd once sent to a struggling startup called Reynolds Propulsion entirely to himself, not out of strategy, but because he genuinely never thought about it again. It had been 4 nights of work born out of loyalty to an old colleague, sent without his name attached because Halbrook's moonlighting clause made it necessary, and by the time Elena died 6 months later, the memory of it had simply been buried under grief, the way most small kindnesses get buried under larger griefs. He had no idea Reynolds Propulsion still existed. He had no idea it had become Reynolds Aerodyne, a name now printed in gold letters across the tower where, 2 years later, he would apply for a job cleaning the very floors his engineering had helped build. There was a particular Tuesday, 11 months into his handyman years, when Lily asked him at dinner whether he missed his old job, the one with the airplanes. He told her, honestly, that he missed the problems more than the job. The specific feeling of a hard thing finally clicking into place, but that nothing he'd ever built mattered more to him than being the one who made her breakfast. She'd seemed satisfied with that answer, in the uncomplicated way 8-year-olds accept true things, and gone back to her macaroni. Mason had sat with the conversation longer than he let on, turning it over the way he once turned over engineering problems, and concluded, not for the first time, that he had made peace with disappearing. He did not yet know that disappearing was about to become impossible. 8 months would pass, quietly and without incident, before an ordinary Tuesday morning changed everything. Neither of them, 4 states apart and unaware of each other's existence, had ever expected to collide again. The morning Mason Carter, needing steadier hours and better benefits for a daughter about to start 4th grade, submitted an application to Reynolds Aerodyne's night janitorial staff, never once connecting the company's name to the 11 pages he'd sent, unpaid and unsigned. 3 years and a lifetime ago, for the first 6 weeks, Victoria said nothing to him. She had her reasons, most of which she examined honestly, and some of which she didn't. She wanted to know who Mason Carter actually was before she risked making him a symbol, a headline, or worse, a liability the company's legal team would want managed rather than honored. She'd had a private investigator, quiet, discreet, someone she'd used exactly twice before, both times for real threats, confirm what the resume implied and what her gut had already told her the moment she read his name. Mason Carter, formerly of Halbrook Dynamics, 11 patents filed, 7 quietly stripped of his name following his departure, a reputation that had been allowed to erode rather than actively destroyed, which was in some ways worse, because there was no single villain to point at, just an institution's collective decision to let a grieving man disappear. And there, buried in an old file transfer log from Reynolds Propulsion's earliest servers, the ones her CTO had almost deleted twice, kept only because Victoria had an instinct for archiving anything that had once saved the company, was the IP address and submission timestamp that, cross-referenced with an old consulting invoice Halbrook had once absurdly tried to bill Mason for unauthorized use of company time, confirmed it beyond any real doubt. Mason Carter had saved her company, anonymously, for nothing, 3 years before he ever needed a night janitorial job to make ends meet. She sat with that fact the way she sat with very few facts in her professional life, unable to fold it into a strategy, unable to make it smaller than it was. She had built Reynolds Aerodyne into an institution employing 4,000 people, and the entire foundation of it rested on 11 pages, written by a man who was currently 3 floors below her office, emptying the recycling bins outside conference room 4C at 11:40 at night. She watched him, carefully and without his knowledge, for those 6 weeks, not out of suspicion, but because she genuinely did not know what to do with what she'd learned. And some instinct told her that whatever she decided needed to be earned through observation rather than announced through gratitude he hadn't asked for. What she saw unsettled her more than the patents had. She saw him, twice, stay 90 minutes past his shift to quietly reroute a jammed HVAC control panel in Building C's server room that facilities had been unable to diagnose for 3 weeks, using nothing but a multimeter from his own toolbox and the kind of patient, exacting logic that Victoria recognized instantly from the 11 pages she now knew he'd written. He never filed a ticket claiming credit. He left a handwritten note taped to the panel for the day facilities crew, in plain language, explaining the fix in case it recurred. He signed it only night shift. She saw him sit alone in the break room at 2 a.m. On nights he worked a double, eating a sandwich he'd clearly packed himself, sketching something on a paper napkin. She got close enough once, under the pretense of getting coffee, To see it was a wing mount stress diagram, elegant and unmistakably expert, done for no reason she could imagine, except that his mind apparently could not stop solving problems, even when nobody was paying him to. He threw the napkin away when he finished it, and she saw on a Thursday afternoon when his shift accidentally overlapped with a school half-day. Mason arrived briefly with his daughter in tow, waiting for a coworker to cover the last hour of his shift, and watched through her office window as he crouched down to Lily's height in the lobby, listening, actually listening, with his full attention, the way almost nobody in Victoria's professional life listened to anything, while she told him some clearly enormous 8-year-old story about a classroom hamster. Victoria had sat in that window longer than she meant to, watching a man the company's own legal filings no longer credited for his own inventions, giving a child his entire undivided presence, and felt something in her chest she hadn't expected and didn't immediately know how to name. There's a particular kind of quiet competence that doesn't announce itself, the kind some of you watching have seen in a parent, a coworker, or maybe in yourselves. The people who fix what's broken and never once ask to be thanked for it. It's easy, in a world that rewards the loudest voice in the room, to wonder whether staying silent so long ever really serves anyone, or whether Mason should have spoken up about what happened to him years before Victoria ever found out on her own. That's not a question with one right answer, and we'd genuinely love to hear where you land on it. It was Sarah Chen, Victoria's chief of staff and the one person she'd eventually trusted with the full truth, who found the second piece of the puzzle. The piece that turned Victoria's quiet respect into something closer to fury. Digging through Halbrook Dynamics' public patent filings at Victoria's request, Sarah discovered that 2 of the 7 patents stripped of Mason's name had, 18 months after his departure, been refiled under Derek Holt's name alone, and that Derek Holt, now a senior VP at Halbrook, frequently quoted in trade press as one of the industry's rising innovators, was, at that very moment, in the final stages of negotiating a licensing deal with a mutual aerospace supplier that Reynolds Aerodyne also did business with, a deal built entirely on cooling chamber geometry that, according to the original Reynolds submission logs Sarah cross-referenced, was mathematically identical to work Mason had done years before he ever set foot in the Reynolds building. Victoria confronted the pattern from her office late one night, cross-referencing timestamps until nearly 1 a.m., and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with sympathy, and everything to do with the particular fury of watching a theft complete itself in plain sight while everyone congratulated the thief. She decided, that night, that observation was no longer enough. She found Mason the following Tuesday at the end of his shift, in the empty lobby of Building C, and for the first time since the interview 6 weeks earlier, she said his name without pretending it was ordinary. "Mason," she said, "I know who you are. I know what you sent us 3 years ago. And I know what happened to you at Halbrook." He didn't flinch, exactly. But something in his shoulders went very still. The particular stillness of a man bracing for a conversation he'd spent years avoiding. "I don't know what you mean," he said, though his voice made it clear that he did. "The thermal fix," Victoria said quietly. 11 pages, no name. It saved this company before it was a company. I never knew who sent it until I saw your resume 6 weeks ago. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't what she expected. "I didn't apply here because of that," he said. "I didn't even remember it was the same company until I was already in the interview, and by then it felt strange to bring up. I just needed the job." "I want to give you your name back," Victoria said, "your patents. A position that actually uses what you can do. I can start tomorrow. Title, salary, whatever you need." Mason shook his head, slowly, and the answer that came out of him surprised her more than anything else had that night. "I don't want a title," he said. "I don't want to be a story in your press release. I have a daughter who needs me home by 6, and I've spent 2 years building a life that doesn't fall apart if one more thing goes wrong. I appreciate what you're offering. I do. But I need you to understand, I'm not looking to be rescued." He left her standing in the lobby with an answer she hadn't prepared for, and a growing, uncomfortable understanding that restoring what Mason Carter had lost was going to require far more from her than money or a job title. It was going to require her to actually see him, the way she suspected almost no one since his wife died ever fully had. 1 month later, an anonymous industry tip One Victoria hadn't sent, though she'd later wonder for a long time who had, would land in a trade journalist's inbox, containing internal Halbrook documents about the cooling chamber patents, and set in motion an unraveling that neither Victoria nor Mason would be able to control once it began. The tip reached a reporter named Priya Anand at Aerotrade Weekly, and Priya, who had a well-earned reputation for not letting an interesting document sit unverified, spent 3 weeks quietly working the story before she ever called Halbrook Dynamics for comment. What she found, cross-referencing the anonymous documents against public patent records and old Halbrook internal emails obtained through a source Priya never named, painted a picture damning enough that Derek Holt's own legal team, once they finally saw it, urged him to settle before publication rather than fight it. The emails, internal, years old, never meant to surface, showed Derek explicitly instructing a junior patent attorney, 18 months after Mason's departure, to clean up the inventor field on 2 specific filings, citing Mason's exit as sufficient justification, with no actual technical basis for the change. It was not ambiguous. It was, in the flat language of a subpoena Halbrook's own outside counsel would later draft against Derek personally, a documented pattern of misattribution. Victoria learned about Priya's investigation 2 days before it went to print, from a courtesy call the reporter made to Reynolds Aerodyne for comment, since the licensing deal Derek Holt had been finalizing involved a supplier Reynolds also worked with. Victoria said almost nothing on the record. Off the record, she asked Priya one question: whether Mason Carter's name would appear anywhere in the piece. Only if he wants it to, Priya said. I reached out to him directly. He didn't respond. Victoria understood immediately why. Mason had told her himself, a month earlier, standing in that empty lobby, that he wasn't looking to be rescued, and here was rescue arriving anyway, in the form of a press expose he'd never asked for, threatening to turn his quiet, rebuilt life into a headline whether he consented to it or not. She found him that night on shift, in the server room of Building C, running a diagnostic on a cooling unit that had been flagging errors all week. Work far beneath his training, work he did anyway, with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, because he'd never once, in 2 months on the job, done anything less than his absolute best at a task nobody was watching him do. There's a story coming out about Derek Holt, she told him. About the patents. You don't have to be part of it. But I think you should know it's happening, because it's going to raise your name whether you're quoted or not. Mason set down his multimeter. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and Victoria watched something move behind his eyes that she recognized now, after 2 months of quiet observation, as the specific expression of a man doing an enormous silent calculation. Lily doesn't know any of this happened, he said finally. She was too young when I left Halbrook to remember it, and I never told her the real reason. If this comes out, she's going to ask questions I don't know how I want to answer yet. I can't stop the story, Victoria said. I wouldn't, even if I could. What happened to you deserves to be known, and Derek Holt deserves exactly what's coming to him. But I can make sure you get to decide how you're part of it, instead of finding out from a headline the way I almost let you. It was, Mason would understand only much later, the exact moment his opinion of Victoria Reynolds changed. Not because she offered to fix anything, but because she was the first person in 3 years to hand him the choice back instead of making it for him. He asked for 1 day to think, and spent that evening the way he spent most evenings, making dinner with Lily, helping her with a fraction worksheet at the kitchen table, reading 2 chapters of a chapter book about a dog before bed, and only after she was asleep did he sit at the same kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, and actually let himself think about Halbrook, about Derek's cooling chamber presentation in that conference room 18 months before he understood what it meant, about the 11 pages he'd sent a struggling startup for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, and about the strange, unlikely fact that the right thing he'd done anonymously 3 years ago had somehow found its way back to stand in his kitchen doorway, quietly, in the form of a billionaire CEO who had learned to listen to an 8-year-old's hamster story instead of rushing past it. He called Victoria the next morning and told her he'd talked to Priya Anand, on the record, but only about the technical facts, the design work, the timeline, the patents, and not one word about Elena or Lily or the 2 years of handyman work he considered nobody's business but his own, Victoria agreed without hesitation and made sure, in the days that followed, that every conversation with the reporter honored exactly that line, personally reviewing the piece before publication, not to control the narrative but to make sure it protected the one thing Mason had asked her to protect. The story ran 9 days later under the headline, "The Engineer Halbrook Erased," and it detailed, in clean and devastating prose, the redesigned Mason had built for a struggling startup that became Reynolds Aerodyne, the patents quietly stripped from him following his departure, and the internal emails showing Derek Holt orchestrating the erasure of Mason's name from work that was unmistakably his. Halbrook Dynamics placed Derek Holt on administrative leave within 18 hours of publication. 3 of Reynolds Aerodyne's supplier partners, citing the licensing deal's now compromised provenance, quietly withdrew from negotiations with Halbrook entirely. Mason did not watch the story break online. He was, at the exact hour it published, sitting on the floor of Lily's room, helping her build a diorama of the solar system out of styrofoam balls for a school project. Entirely unaware that 4 states away, his name was trending for the first time in his life, attached at last to work that had always quietly been his. It would be Victoria who called him that evening, her voice unsteady in a way he'd never heard from her, to tell him the story had done more than clear his name. It had cracked open something at Halbrook that neither of them had anticipated, and that the company's board, facing mounting pressure, was preparing an offer neither of them had seen coming. Halbrook Dynamics' offer arrived 11 days later, delivered by a lawyer neither Mason nor Victoria had ever met, in language so careful it had clearly been drafted by 6 different people terrified of further liability. Full reinstatement of Mason's name on all 7 patents, a settlement figure large enough that Mason read it twice to make sure he hadn't misplaced a decimal point, and a public statement acknowledging an internal failure in attribution practices that stopped 1 careful degree short of using the word theft. Victoria watched him read it in her office, the late afternoon light doing something gold and ordinary across the glass of desks where, 3 months earlier, his resume had first stopped her breathing. "You could take this and never work another day in your life," she said. "You could take Lily anywhere, do anything. You've more than earned that." Mason folded the letter closed. "I don't want their money," he said. "Not because I don't need it. Believe me, I know exactly what it would mean for Lily's future. But I want something they can't put a dollar figure on. I want the 7 patents corrected publicly, with my name on them, permanently, in the actual filed record. Not a settlement that disappears into an NDA. And I want a fund in Elena's name for engineers who lose their footing after something happens in their life that has nothing to do with their skill. The kind of fund that might have let someone check in on me 2 years ago instead of managing me out the door." It took Halbrook's board 6 more weeks to agree to both terms, and when they finally did, the patent correction became a matter of public record. 7 filings, Mason Carter's name restored in the exact place it had always belonged, and the Elena Carter Fund for Engineering Resilience launched with an initial endowment that would, within its first year, quietly support 14 engineers navigating exactly the kind of private crisis that had once cost Mason nearly everything. Reynolds Aerodyne, for its part, offered Mason a position matching his actual training, lead propulsion engineer, a title with real weight and real say in the company his own anonymous work had once saved. He accepted it, on one condition he stated as plainly as he'd once stated his need for a job that fit around a school bus schedule. Flexible hours, no travel until Lily was older, and no press appearances beyond the 1 interview he'd already given. Victoria agreed before he finished the sentence. The quiet coda came 4 months later, on an ordinary Wednesday evening in early spring, in the same lobby of Building C where Victoria had once told him she knew who he was. Mason had finished a full day in his new role, his real role at last, doing the work he'd been built for, and was waiting for Lily, who'd been dropped off by a friend's parent for the school science fair, happening in Reynolds Aerodyne's community auditorium that night, a small local event the company sponsored every spring for kids in the neighborhood. Victoria found him there, watching Lily set up a modest baking soda volcano at a folding table, with the same intense concentration her father brought to everything, and stood beside him for a while, without saying anything, the way 2 people can stand together once the urgent part of a story is finally over. "She's going to be exactly like you," Victoria said eventually. I hope not entirely, Mason said, and there was something almost like a smile in it. I'd like her to ask for help sooner than I did. Victoria looked at him, really looked, the way she'd first learned to, through a window 3 months earlier. Watching a man give a child his full and undivided attention in a lobby he thought no one was watching. For what it's worth, she said, I'm glad you didn't disappear. I'm glad you looked twice at that resume, Mason said, instead of just once. Lily's volcano erupted, a modest fizz of foam that delighted exactly the small, easily delighted crowd it was built for. And Mason crossed the room to crouch beside his daughter and tell her, with complete sincerity, that it was the best volcano he'd ever seen, and Victoria watched him do it, and understood that this, not the $12 billion valuation, not the 7 restored patents, not even the fund bearing Elena's name, was the actual center of gravity in Mason Carter's life, and had been the whole time. If there's one thing this story asks of you, it's this. Think of someone in your own life who was underestimated, dismissed, or quietly written off before anyone bothered to find out who they really were. A coworker, a parent, maybe even someone you didn't fully see yourself until much later. Who was it, and what would it mean to finally say, out loud, that you saw them? We'd love for you to share that name or that memory in the comments below, even if all you can offer them now is the credit they always deserved. Mason Carter never asked to be a symbol of anything. He built an engine in silence, lost a wife without warning, disappeared into the unglamorous work of raising a daughter alone, and never once, in any of it, sought recognition for the quiet, exacting decency that ran underneath every choice he made. The world found him anyway, eventually, the way it sometimes does for people who never stopped doing the work simply because it was right. And if that kind of story means something to you, if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be truly seen, we hope you'll stay part of this one with us. There's always another story worth telling, about someone worth finding.